Tonight, Sky News will air the first interview with Cheng Lei since the journalist arrived back in Australia after 3 years in a Chinese detention centre. Our Washington correspondent Annelise Nielsen is a former colleague of hers who campaigned actively for her release and has done this sit-down interview, which will air this evening on Bolt at 7 p.m. Eastern. Annelise, good to see you back in Australia. Tell us, how is Cheng Lei going? It's obviously just such a huge relief to have her back on home soil.
Look, it's just a complete miracle. I've said this a few times, but we used to war game everything we did. And we would say, like, what's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario? Should we do it? Should we not do it? And every time the fantasy option was like, well, maybe she'll get popped on a plane and just pop up back in Australia and it's all over. And it was always kind of laughed off as like, no, but really, what are we going to do? What's going to happen? And then it's happened and she's doing so well. I think the interesting thing is we've known a lot more about what's happened to her than she has in a lot of ways, because she's only had these half-hour consular visits once a month, and in those she's getting messages from her kids read out, she's getting a lot of information very quickly. So now she's kind of catching up on a lot of what happened, and so part of their interview was just sitting down and going through a lot of the stuff on the internet, and she had no idea that so many people in Australia cared about her story. She's being stopped in the street in Melbourne with people hugging her. She's very into hugging. She hasn't had proper hugs in a long time, so she was just hugging everyone, just who's really happy for her. And it's just in such a bleak time. This has just been such a good story, and I'm so happy I got to be a part of it.
Yeah, we are all just so happy that this is the end result. I interviewed Peter Gress last week, the journalist who obviously has his own experience of being behind bars in a foreign nation for many years before his release was finally negotiated. And he really related to the comments that she made last week about just how much of a blessing it is to actually see the wide open sky. And then he went on to talk about how it's just such a readjustment to go from being behind bars and having no agency over anything in awful conditions to this suddenly being as free as a bird back in Australia. Is she finding that as well?
Yeah, I think she has found it quite overwhelming. She goes into that in the interview. She talks about just kind of how many colours are in the world that you don't realise until you've been in a cell all the time. And she talked about when she's in the prison cell, you're there with a few other people, but the lights are on 24/7, there's cameras in the ceiling, and they'll come over the speakerphone if you're doing something wrong. And that's a 24-hour a day, even if you're in the bathroom, they're watching. And so she's gone from that to a cushy bed, and at one point she got emotional talking about sitting on a couch for the first time in 3 years. And it's just so many things you take for granted. And all of a sudden she's just got this assault of freedom at her. But I think one of the things I wanted to know immediately, and I've been asked by so many people, was what was her first meal when she got back? And here's what she had.
I gorged myself at the Vic Market, you know, the temple of good eating.
Yeah.
And had bratwurst, had borek, then hot chocolate to wash it down, bought Moreton Bay bugs, Sydney rock oysters, and what else? What didn't I buy? I was just going crazy at the produce market, you know, blood oranges, just swooning at the fine produce on offer.
I think we'd all agree that she deserves to feast like a queen as much as she wants after what she's been through. Annelise, are we learning much more about the diplomatic efforts that actually led to this result? Because obviously a lot was going on behind the scenes for so long that we in the media and more broadly the public wouldn't have been fully aware of.
Yes, and she goes into that a bit, even from her perspective, how she noticed a shift in how the meetings were conducted after there was a change in government. I think that's a really interesting part of this, and it's going to be a longer discussion, but it does just seem like the more we understand about what's happened, this really was just a diplomatic effort to get her out. And I didn't realise she'd actually met Penny Wong in 2014, she says, and when Penny Wong came in, she sent her a personal letter saying that her case was important, and she made the point, she was like, it didn't feel like Polly speak, it felt like someone who really cared. And I think even just the psychological impact of that made a huge difference when you're there. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate too that she was being held there and the sentencing kept getting pushed back every few months, which is a normal part of their process. And so she didn't know how long she could be there. For the charges she was up against, it was 10 plus years was a potential sentence, or time served, which was the best case scenario and ended up being what happened. So for someone in that position, it's not like you're telling yourself, I just need to survive X amount of days and I'm out of here. It just feels like it could go on forever. You're thinking about your kid that you left behind who's 11, could potentially be in her 20s by the time you see her again. So it's that, I think, was the worst part of it. And that's where Peter Grest and Carly Moore-Gilbert were huge helps. They were personally corresponding with her. They sent her their books. And she got really into reading survival books, Nelson Mandela's autobiography, all of that, because it was just about how do you put yourself in that frame of mind. And then she's incredibly resilient. She taught herself German and Japanese in there. I can't be that productive now. It's incredible. It's such an incredible story. I'm so just absolutely honoured that I get to be part of telling the story. But I think we're going to hear a lot more from her, and I'm glad.
Oh, well, we all cannot wait to watch the full interview this evening. Annelise, Nielsen, thank you for that. And you can watch Annelise's interview on the Bolt Report. That's happening tonight from 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time.